So if everyone is here, shall I start or is someone going to join? Okay. Okay. So is the screen visible to everyone? Okay. So when we were discussing the scheduling, I suggested to Apurva that let's watch Camera Eye and No Other Land because that will in some sense prepare the ground, not the films in isolation, but watching them together, one after the other in sequence, in relation to each other. And I thought that that may help us actually straight away launch into the discussion of image as one of the central themes which Shomu sir also spoke in the first half, that what is image's relation to cinema? Yeah. Because popularly we tend to think of image and cinema almost in synonymous terms, of course. Yeah. And yes, image is the central integral part of cinematic composition or construction. One could say that cinema is more than image. That is the first proposition I would like to make, that cinema fundamentally is interested in relating images. Yeah. So by image, if you mean something which, and I'm going to speak about image in a very specific sense later, but in a very broad general sense, one could say, especially in the context of the contemporary media society which sir spoke in the morning, where we are saturated by images, yeah, where images are continuously circulated around us, we are immersed in images. So insofar as that, image is that which abolishes any possible distance, yeah, mental, cognitive distance, and it produces a kind of a sensory saturation, yeah, because it's a kind of circulation which is also premised upon instantaneity, which Sir speaks about in his book. Some of you may have heard or seen a copy of this book called Thoughts of Gaza, Far from Gaza. So one of the premise of the book is that, is it possible today to conceive of a film like Camera Eye about Gaza? That Jean-Luc Godard made a film like Camera Eye in the context of Vietnam. Is it possible to think about a film like this in the context of Gaza? From there on, Sir takes us to the discussion of this instantaneous repetition and continuous circulation of images surrounding us. Yeah. So if we take that as a starting point to reflect upon what we mean by images in this case, and here we are also talking about a specific kinds of images, because images also can be talked about in a much broader general sense. We are specifically talking about images which are photographically or cinematographically produced. Yeah. So the premise is that these images are actually evidences of something which takes place out there in the world. So images not only represent reality, but they record reality. So there is virtually no distinction between the reality recorded and the image. Writing in 1950s, André Bazin speaks of this relation between image and reality as indexical. Yeah. Those who've studied semiotics would have heard of these different relationships, yeah? The iconic, symbolic, indexical, right? So the indexical relationship is considered to be emerging with the arrival of photography. So if a portrait represents a face, then its relationship with the face is that of iconic relationship. They are still two distinct things. There is a face and there is a portrait. But with the coming of photography, the identity photograph is not an image of face, it is face. So in that sense, we are talking about image as indexical in the present context of circulation of these images, where we are made to believe that these images are self-evident, transparent, giving us an access to the reality out there almost without mediation. So kind of a immediacy. So by overcoming distance, it is also overcoming mediation itself, the instantaneity. So we are actually seeing now coming together of both these ideas, indexicality, which is with us since the middle of 19th century, and a certain instantaneity which is primarily emerging after 2008, 2009. The development of the combined development of internet, smartphones, social media, so on and so forth. All of us have witnessed this transition. So on the backdrop of that, how do we now investigate the relationship between, let's say, image and cinema today in the context of Gaza, but also in terms of understanding our relationship with politics. So say this is a triangle: image, cinema, politics. Tomorrow in the discussion we'll dwell further upon the aspect of politics. Today I'll try to focus more upon the question of image and also linking it to the problem of distance. As Sir posed in the book, that today it is extremely difficult for us to be at a distance from Gaza in that sense. So even if we are using the title of Godard's film Here and Elsewhere, the moment images infiltrate, the here and the elsewhere actually are no longer separable by any distance, reflective cognitive distance, at least at a virtual level, at the sensory level. So then how do we actually think about distance today? Are there films, or is cinema addressing this problem of distance today? So I thought maybe I could take up actually this question from Sir's book and look at the kinds of films which have been made within the Palestinian situation over last 2 decades, or let's say a decade and a half, from 2011 to tomorrow we'll be watching from Ground Zero 25, and within these 15 years how cinema, and especially what Sir was referring to as documentary cinema, is responding to this question of distance. See, because documentary cinema has a very peculiar relationship with immediacy, because the history of documentary cinema is also linked with the history of the evolution, technological evolution of medium on one hand. So especially in the context of war, lightweight cameras were invented, Second World War I'm referring to. So after Second World War, these lightweight cameras enabled people to venture out into the world, like a solitary cameraman with a recorder who could document reality more freely. So that led to a certain kind of a documentary emerging, particularly in America, which was also called as direct cinema. So again, the name direct refers to a certain immediacy, an observational mode. Another popular term from that is called fly on the wall. So, which refers to a transparency, that it almost takes us to the very place where the event is unfolding by overcoming the distance. Then this observational documentary was also tied to the emergence of television and the transmission of this onto television with a certain liveliness, which later of course gets plugged into the history of news. But what I mean to say is that the question of documentary was actually tied from 1950s onwards to the development of newer equipments, camera equipments, and the shift from, let's say, the heavyweight cameras to lightweight cameras, from celluloid to video to digital. Yeah. So at one level, this observational mode of documentary, which was also in the French context called as cinema verite, though of course it was also a critique of the American direct cinema, but in some sense shared certain aspects with it, which is the capacity or the possibility of taking camera out there into the world and to be able to document reality without prescripting it, with a certain spontaneity, with a certain directness, with a certain immediacy. Yet of course cinema verite believed in critically reflecting upon it rather than factually recording it, but for a moment we could keep that distinction aside. So keeping that in mind, when we actually come to the problem of distance and the documentary in the last 15 years, it would be interesting for us to kind of juxtapose these two films, Camera Eye and No Other Land, almost separated by more than 50 years actually. So in one case, you actually see the heavy camera, the celluloid camera, and Jean-Luc Godard standing with the camera looking into it, but looking into what? So the strategy he actually employs is to reflect, speculatively make a film on Vietnam because he is not being able to go there. So there is, as Sir talks about in the book, that there is a self-conscious isolation and alienation which he imposes upon himself and exposes the powerlessness of the medium, reflects upon the powerlessness of the cinema as medium through cinema itself, to capture the reality of Vietnam by asking a question: what does it mean to make a film on Vietnam? Yeah. Where the question of what is the relationship between being in Paris, being a European, making a film on Vietnam means. Yeah. So instead of invading Vietnam with the generosity, as he says, or instead of making those same kinds of images which American or the Soviet journalists are making, he chooses a distinct path. Yeah. Now, when you come to No Other Land, you actually are in a very different situation, where of course the camera is no longer at a distance. The camera is pretty much a part of the milieu. Not only one camera, several cameras continuously shooting. They are a part of resistance, a part of a certain activism, part of actually disseminating information to civil society, creating awareness. Basically resisting the invisibilization of Palestine by continuously making the eviction visible, the demolitions visible. Yeah. And through that, of course, building a certain popular support, public support. So we completely actually are in a different situation with No Other Land than Camera Eye at one level. But at another level, the question of distance still remains in both these cases, that how do we still constitute a minimal distance to make that very situation thinkable. So then for us today to think about that, what are the strategies, let's say, the films in last 10-15 years, the documentary films made in Palestine by our filmmakers who, from different parts of the world, are employing. That may help us understand the question of distance away from the idea of a sheer physical distance. In the book, actually, Sir talks about several kinds of distances. Anthropological distance between worlds, where there is no common shared idea of everyone belonging to, let's say, quote-unquote human race, where some are considered to be civilized and human, or others as lesser, sub, or inhuman. Those kinds of anthropological, let's say, asymmetries or disparities we don't find ourselves today. At one level, we are told that we all live in one world. At least after the collapse of the Soviet Union and collapse of, let's say, the bipolarity or the end of the Cold War, where at least there were minimally three worlds. After that, this question of world, and here I've mentioned in the title the formulation from Sir's book, Palestine as world. And today also the first half he ended on that note, and he said tomorrow we'll discuss this further. What do we mean by Palestine as world? So it is in this context of, let's say, this imposition of this single world, this homogenized world of capital nation state, what does it mean to think about distance? So that's another aspect of it. The first aspect is, of course, the instantaneous repetition and circulation of images. At another level, the fact that there is only one world. And yet within that world, how does one really constitute a distance? Because actually the world of Europe or France or somebody living in Paris and Vietnam were worlds apart in that sense. But today, can we say that? So when we bring these two things together, then one can actually begin to understand what is Sir proposing by Palestine as world. And I want to actually understand how some of the strategies employed by the filmmakers in last 15 years are in their own ways attempting to construct an imagination of Palestine as world. So let me just briefly talk about the idea of Palestine as world as Sir talks about in the book. As I understand it, he is primarily proposing that in relationship with other three terms, that Palestine as a world in relation to Israel as state, or the way in the Israel's imagination Hamas is a scenario, or this whole idea of flattening of human existence at a biological finite level where human beings as race. So world is that which is not state, not scenario, not race in a very schematic sense. So what do we really mean by the world? And in the morning, Sir has already spoken about it, so I can actually take off from there, is proposing world as that something which is fragile, which is open-ended, which is not a bounded entity, not a territorial entity, not a corporate entity, not a graded entity or a hierarchical entity. The book, Sir, keeps talking about the world as world of thought, of ideas, of critique, of resistance. But most importantly, that which is inconsistent with actually the world one lives in. It actually has no place in that world. So when we are talking about Palestine as a world, is primarily that which is inconsistent with the world we live in today. So also at that level, one can schematically understand the distinction between the two, Palestine as world. And the book also actually culminates with a question that what do we really want to become? What is our desire? To become a race or to become a world? So insofar as that Palestine as a world makes actually something minimally thinkable which this single homogenized world is blocking, which is in some sense a thought of another world, which in till 1980s, 1990s was linked with the figure of revolution, the revolutionary social change. That it was quite commonplace to talk about another world in 20th century by linking it to revolutionary, say, that this is not the only possible world, which means that we are talking about world as that which is the change of world, the change of the structure of the world, the structural relations within that world. Yeah. So fundamentally we are talking about the possibility of an egalitarian world, of a just world, Sir would speak about tomorrow. That's fundamentally linked with the idea or a thought of justice. So with this I want to actually look at a work which is made between Godard's film and No Other Land before we come to No Other Land. The film is quite a peculiar film now to revisit and reflect upon in the light of what we've been thinking about. Is a 2011 film called Five Broken Cameras. Many of you would have seen the film, are aware of the discussions around the film when it came out and so on and so forth. Unlike No Other Land, it has been widely shown in India at different junctures, in different spaces and so on and so forth. But when we are going to reflect upon it today, we'll realize actually its peculiar kind of betweenness. Like on the one side you have Godard's film, on the other side you have No Other Land. And in between it is kind of already beginning to open up a space. Now the premise of Five Broken Cameras is somewhat parallel to that of No Other Land, where the camera becomes an instrument of resistance. That continuously recording violence as it unfolds, the dehumanization, demolitions. And yet, it is actually a retrospective narrative of the breaking apart of those very cameras in the midst of those situations. So as the title itself suggests. So I want us to actually look at those excerpts around the breaking apart of the cameras. The film is, the way I think the narrative of No Other Land is structured around years, from 2019, 20, 21, 22, 23. In a similar sort of a way, the chapters of the films are structured around the breaking of the first camera, the second camera, the third, fourth and fifth, and he continues to go on filming in the midst of it. But what exactly happens at that moment when the camera is hit by a grenade, by a bullet, by a soldier, or smashed onto the ground? What really starts happening to the image? So there we'll actually come to this whole question of image and cinema's response to this whole question of the immediacy, transparency, self-evident nature of image and so on and so forth, by bringing in voiceover or the text as a very important strategy of constituting a minimal distance, a reflective distance upon the images shot by those very cameras. So in some sense, the film is actually using the material shot by the filmmaker as a found material and telling us a story of those moments with a reflective, retrospective distance. So insofar as that, the strategy which Five Broken Camera is actually using goes back to the emergence of what was called in 1940s, 50s, particularly in France, called essay film. which was also unsettling the distinction between the documentary and the fiction, between the narration and the reflection, where the spoken word actually became a prominent part, because till then the idea of cinema, particularly the idea of montage in the history of cinema, which is actually bringing two images together to create a third meaning or a concept or a possibility and so on and so forth, because this idea primarily developed during the silent period, where the idea of the montage hinged upon the visual images, and their juxtaposition. But after the coming of the synchronized sound, and especially in the works of Chris Marker, Ala Rene, later Agnes Varda, a new kind of relationship emerged between the spoken word and the visual image, where the montage is no longer simply just between one image succeeded by another image, but a kind of a simultaneous relationship between an image and a spoken word. So Andre Bazin actually named this as a horizontal montage, where we start from the ear and move to the eye. So in a way, it unsettled the primacy of the eye. And this is a very interesting and important juncture in the history of cinema, which is a decentering of the visible part of the image via sound, via spoken word as a counterpoint, just to make something visible in that image which is not otherwise apparent or transparent or self-evident to us. So insofar as that, actually opening up the image to imagination, to thinking, to reflection, that is where the minimal distance is constituted as an aesthetic strategy on the part of cinema. Because otherwise cinema could simply become an accumulation of images, whereas cinema is primarily an organization of images with a certain principle of that organization. And that principle would still be called as montage, but not in the same sense as, let's say, montage was theorized in 1920s during the silent period by the Soviets. And yet the term montage still continues to actually resonate in 1940s, 50s, even in our times. It still has the same power and the resonance, where one could almost propose cinema as montage. That cinema as that which organizes images with a certain principle of montage, where the relationship between the images, the juxtaposition between the images and between the visual and the sonic, to actually produce a thought which is singular to cinema. So it's not a, let's say, articulation of a conceptual thought using audiovisual means. It's not an illustration of thought, neither it's merely a demonstration of it, but it is using certain means which are proper to cinema. So editing in that sense becomes a central mean, but of course other means come along with it. So when we are talking, and this is something very interesting and important, I recently realized while doing a session on editing, is that, say, in cinema there is a very specific function called editing, but there is a total construction of cinema. At that level also the term editing, as the Soviets were calling montage, makes sense. So it's not a purely post-production stage where now you've shot the images and you're going to put them together, but it is actually with you from your conception to the last stage usually, which is the sound post-production and the color grading. At each of these stages, the cinematic operation is fundamentally that of editing. Just to include something, to exclude something, to sequence something, to reorganize that sequencing, create relationships, juxtapositions, play with the space and the time, image and the sound. So all these fundamentals of cinema. So this also needs to be actually recognized as editing. So it's not simply just, let's say, saying that either the editing is central to it, or let's say the staging, which in the cinematic parlance sometimes called as mise en scène. This is staging with the apparatus of camera. Because there was a debate in 1930s and 40s and created a kind of polarized polemic between the proponents of editing or montage and the proponents of mise en scène, which was pushing towards longer duration shots and minimizing the principal role of editing. But then it became clear that even actually in these long duration choreographed tracking shot, the editing is at work. Because you are actually stitching together multiple shots. Yeah. Even if you are not actually joining or splicing and joining them together, there is already a cut involved in a pan, in a camera movement, in a use of sound, and so on and so forth. So keeping that in mind, now one could actually look at what are the strategies, let's say, Five Broken Cameras uses. So we can lower the light and could. Yeah. I think if not needed, we can put off that light as well. Yeah.
هذا أديب هذا دائما بتحير فرص عشان يعمل مشهد.
يعني هذه الأرض ولدنا فيها وبنعيش وبنموت وسنظل مرابطين فيها من هلا مدى الحياة.
الشغل على السياق الفاصل مستمر بدون تأخير. لازم نضل متماسكين. الناس بتيجي تنضم إلنا من جميع أنحاء العالم، بيجوا مع أفكار مبدعة وأشكال جديدة للاحتجاج، بيقفوا معنا في كل شيء بسيط. في هذا اليوم كسرت كاميرتي الأولى وقمت بإخلاص.
This is the breaking of the first camera. As you saw towards the end of the sequence, the image starts actually breaking apart in terms of its constituent fragments, which we call pixels. So, at the level of giving us an access to reality, it actually reaches its threshold, its limit point. Yeah, the camera itself is attacked. So, which means this whole premise and the promise of the immediacy itself is a very fragile promise. It's a very contingent promise. Camera is continuously exposed to its own breaking apart. But does that mean that cinema is entirely dependent upon the actual physical existence of camera? Or can it open up a possibility of reflecting back upon the breaking apart of that very camera? That moment, and in that moment it is making something visible which the camera itself cannot record or capture. So we can keep this thread in mind and see how the subsequent episodes of breaking apart of the camera unfolds. That what exactly gets illuminated in those moments. And those moments are foretold to us. And of course, he is retrospectively reflecting and looking back at those moments. So in some sense, while those cameras were being broken apart, there is no film. There is only recording, there are only images. The film actually emerges at a point where this idea of making something visible through the very breaking apart of the camera emerges. Something quite parallel happened in the Indian documentary field, a film called My Camera and Tsunami. It's a documentary filmmaker called R.V. Ramani, who, while shooting Tsunami, actually was overtaken by it and his camera got submerged in the water and got destroyed. And he's been using this camera to continuously shoot some or the other thing without really thinking about what is going to happen to those images which is continuously recording, ranging from home videos to travel, to location hunting, to theater performances, to going to film festivals abroad, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, when that camera is destroyed by tsunami, he takes the material shot by that camera and starts organizing it and constructing a narrative by creating new relationship between those images, new sequences through those images. So, and if we trace this back to the history of documentary, you have Dziga Vertov, this man with a movie camera, where we see actually a cameraman going out there in the field and shooting a day in the life of the city, and particularly focusing upon the work, the labor, the production of social life. But there are always two cameras, a camera reflecting upon the camera, a camera which is also exposing the cinema itself as a work, as a labor, which is produced, distributed, circulated, and interrupting this aura of its transparency and immediacy. So in that sense, within the history of cinema, these moments, especially if we use the word documentary in its critical sense, as John Grierson defines sometimes as creative treatment of actuality, because the term actuality was kind of synonymous with the early cinema, the advent of cinema, Louis Lumiere, that the cinematographic views which they were shooting, when the arrival of the train and so on, were called actualities. This is unstaged material. So in a way, the term documentary emerges in 1920s as, let's say, a repurposing of actuality, as a creative treatment, as a reconstruction. And that is where the idea of montage, editing, and so on and so forth becomes important. So in the light of that, let's look at the second moment.
لما نسأل المستوطنة نشوف الطبع أخو الفيل عم يحاول يوقف البناء لوحده. الوضع مش الشكل اللي كان فيه. كانت محافظ على ابتسامته الطفولية. هنتباكم هنتسلم لتنال مطالبيات بكل مكان. هنبدأ في مدي ما بعيا. هنتسلم. هنتدونين عليكم اللي خوف. هنتسلم. مش مرة تعتمد إنك أنت سيد لقيت لك اللي قلت لكم. أنا دلوقتي كيلو. معلش ولا
Here it becomes very clear that camera at that moment is actually not merely an instrument of recording. It's pretty much an instrument of resistance. And yet, that instrument is fragile. It can face its own dismantling. And yet, that instrument actually produces a certain possibility of making the other side accountable with the quote unquote evidence, and that is where the cameraman is continuously exposed to these uncertain situations, danger, being beaten up, the camera being thrashed, and so on and so forth. And yet, along with that evidence, something else also is emerging, which is this film. So in a way, 5 broken cameras is opening a possibility of using that very material which is shot as a evidence could actually be organized as something else. So in that sense, I am using the term found footage. In its immediate context, it is an evidence, but in its retrospective reflection, it is something else. Right. So by this idea, actually one can think about anything which is shot by the camera has a double life. The immediate context in which certain things, and especially actuality. Because when you are revisiting and reflecting back upon it, something else can emerge through that. So in a way, the 5 broken camera is kind of opening up that second life of these images after its immediate context has dissipated, because that immediate context is linked with a certain instantaneous repetition, a circulation, whereas here what's happening is that it's interrupting that logic of circulation and it is constructing a narrative, opening up a possibility of thinking on that very act of recording and shooting. What does it mean? And this becomes actually clear with the third camera which breaks up, and it's a very interesting situation.
והאישור של התוכנית היו לא חוקיים. הצלחנו להוציא צו של בית משפט שמפסיק את כל הבנייה כאוסר איכות של הבתים.
نروح مسيرة.
Não, irmã, nós hoje é aí, irmã. Cada noite vai. Já deixa eu saber? Não, hoje não vai. Não precisa. Aí eu estou fazendo arte e o Leão não pode na barra. Leão aí, nasce na cena. Já te tira de sarfina. Quando eu olhar em teu quarto, já te تصوير يا عمار.
لازم استمر بالتصوير. صوت فيه الجنبي. يمكن أنها تكون كاميرا الثالثة أن تتعيدني. الرصاصة لسه مزروعة فيها كتذكير قديش الحياة هشة. لازم ألاقي قوة داخلية عشان أقدر أستمر. كل الأشياء المنيحة اللي بنحب نعملها. طبيعي. قول. الزمن بمر والناس لسه بتيجي تتظاهر كل يوم جمعة. لكن ما اعتقدتم بناء الجدار باتجاه مرة ثانية. الناس بتحس إنه ما في إشي ممكن يوقف الاحتلال من الاستمرار. بالتالي قررت إني أعمل إشي عشان أرفع معنوياتهم. عرض المشاهد اللي بصورها اسمح للناس بأنها تتفرج على اللي بصير مع أخذ مسافة منه. بفكر إنه هذا بيساهم في خلق حالة تضامن بيننا. بشجعنا على مساندة ودعم قرى ثانية عشان تبدأ وتحتاج. ل 2008 صار في كثير قرى في جميع أنحاء الضفة الغربية اللي بتأخذ نضال بالعين كنموذج لشكل جديد من المقاومة.
So here we actually see by the third camera breaking apart, an absolutely new possibility or consequence emerge where the villagers come, sit together and watch this footage together. Yeah. That it opens up a possibility of reflecting upon what they have endured, gone through, suffered through from a distance, and that fosters a solidarity and encourages other villages to also take up that struggle. Then you realize that it's not just the question of the instantaneity of what is happening. It's not the question of the immediate outcome. But now that is outcome with a certain lag, with a certain distance. And that is opening up a different possibility. So the courage to go on is now in this case ironically linked with the demise of that very camera. Because that is then prompting him to look back at the material he has shot. The situation we also saw with Ramani's case. So in some sense the demise of the camera need to be taken also as an opportunity to reflect upon what one has shot. So this ceaseless accumulation of images is actually detrimental to the very idea of cinema. That with endless accumulation of images, there cannot be cinema. So in that sense, cinema is fundamentally about actually subtracting from this ever accumulating images. One of the great filmmakers and theorists of montage, Alexander Kluger, actually says that we need fewer images. Because when you are accumulated and surrounded by images, it actually blocks perception, blocks seeing, blocks thinking, blocks reflection. Because those images operate at the level of pure sensation. It's only when you subtract from it and then speculatively reflect upon that which is not apparent or visible onto the surface, then only something like cinema can emerge. So which is why today when we see after, let's say, 14, 15 years, 5 broken cameras, then one actually realizes the gap between No Other Land and 5 broken cameras. Or in what ways 5 broken cameras is between Camera Eye and No Other Land. And No Other Land actually quite perceptively recognizes this impasse. So in that sense, it's also a film which is making us see this saturation of this very act of continuously shooting and making images. Because it is now no longer actually subjected to these breaking apart of cameras. No, one can actually continue to shoot, continue to record, continue to upload, continue to circulate, but then the impasse is at another level, as both these friends keep talking about. At one level, it gives you this kind of a enthusiastic feeling that, oh, suddenly things can change. So in one of the car conversations, the friend of asks Yuval that, do you think that you can come here for 10 days and suddenly everything will change? And that conversation is actually linked with the fact that, yes, today it gives us a feeling that this instantaneous repetition can bring about instantaneous change too. Yeah. But that is precisely the impasse and the saturation. Then in the later part of the film, when both of them are conversing and they're thinking about how to come together, start a new life and what kind of a job he can do, so on and so forth, at that point, Yuval says that, yeah, people watch and are touched by it, but then what? Yeah, it is seen by these many people, liked by these many people, circulated by these many people, but then what? So these are actually the moments in No Other Land, which retrospectively will tell us the saturation of the contemporary moment in terms of the instantaneous circulation of images and what it does. So in a way, the taking place of cinema in the film is those moments in No Other Land. Or when he is looking back and reflecting upon the material which is shot when he is young, when he is growing up. Yeah. But otherwise, the material which is shot to document the unfolding violence in itself is actually not where the cinema lies. So in a way, that could be the distinction, as Sir also proposed in the morning, between images and cinema. That what happens to those images when they are organized cinematically, when they are organized with a certain artistic principle. And that artistic principle need not be counterposed against some kind of immediate political use of those images. In fact, it is reflection upon the very politics and creatively, critically reflecting upon that. As Godard also says that in Camera, that they are locked up in the economic prism, I am locked up in my cultural prism. That my main concern is the American film industry and the imperialism and the way they invade and so on and so forth. And what I can do is that whatever film I make, I can continuously talk about Vietnam. That bring Vietnam in whatever I am making. So there one also kind of understands this tense relationship between these two, let's say, aesthetic and the political usages of those images. So in camera eye, the physical distance, anthropological distance, and so on and so forth becomes a very condition. The breaking of the camera provides that very condition in 5 broken cameras, and the impasse of the instantaneous circulation becomes a very condition in no other land for the cinema to take place. That is where one actually finds a minimal distance, but also progressively that distance is becoming narrower and narrower. And that I feel kind of homologous to when I was looking at and reading the material, which is primarily coming from 2 different lines of inquiry, but also there is a lot of give and take and exchange between those lines. One is from the within Israeli context, which is a new historian's work, which started coming out from late 1990s, early 2000s. And around the same time, a certain framework of settler colonial studies, which first emerged in Australia and New Zealand, and then emerged as a comparative global framework through which today we make sense of Israel. Now I would just schematically lay out some contours of the settler colonial framework and the way it draws upon the empirically rich historical account produced by new historians. The first important thing is, of course, the distinction between the classical colonialism and, you can put in the light for a couple of minutes, then I'll go back and the second part I'll do. So, we touched upon this in the first half also, and it's quite apparent to us now that one needs to distinguish the kind of colonial rule which exists in Israel. It's not, quote unquote, the classical colonial rule. Now, the settler colonial studies actually proposes a metaphor, a pathological medical metaphor, that the classical colonial rule is viral, whereas the settler colonial is bacterial. That in the viral infection, you actually need the other body. So, the body of the colonized, the oppressed, the exploited, in terms of labor, in terms of resources, and so on and so forth. But the distinction is still thinkable between the mother country and the colonial land and the people. So, it's a structural relationship of domination over those people, and which has a certain expiry date, which is broadly linked with this process of decolonization. That there is a thinkable, imaginable end, at least now retrospectively. Of course, in the height of 19th century, even the classical colonial rule people were thinking will go on. With this whole historical parallel with the Roman Empire. And this continuous thing that can the British Empire will overcome the fate of the Roman Empire? Could it perpetuate itself? Particularly with these dominions which separated, but this whole fascination of the Commonwealth, where it could still be kept under some broader umbrella, imperial umbrella in 1910s and 20s and 10s and 20s, and that is where also the Anglo-Saxon origin of the discipline of international relations also lies. That how do you manage the inter-race relationship, the gradations, the hierarchy at a global level, and create a new kind of a justification to the imperial rule and so on and so forth. But of course, all of that started collapsing within 3 decades, and by 1950s and 60s, it was apparent that the classical colonial rule cannot sustain. But it is precisely in this transition the state of Israel emerges, which is the eclipse of the classical colonial rule and the emergence, at least one site of emergence. The settler colonial studies is now broadly looking at it on a longue durée historical framework as a settler revolution. So starting from United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Israel, so on and so forth. So where one of the attempts is to de-exceptionalize Israel and also to situate it on the much broader historical framework to also address the kind of political struggles, because when this emerged as an academic framework within Australia, it emerged as a critique of the post-colonial studies, which was premised upon at least the formal end of the colonial rule and the continued, let's say, ramifications, consequences of that, where the major archive was South Asia. So the Australian and the New Zealand scholars were challenging that and proposing a different anthropological framework to understand settler colonial context with no end. Now, in this longue durée framework, they like one of the important theorists, Lorenzo Veracini, proposes in his recent book called The Settler Revolution, that is saying that usually in the European context there is a framework of revolution, counter-revolution, but both of them are actually linked with revolution as a break from the past in a temporal sense, where the revolution actually is a break from the old regime and a new regime actually begins to emerge. And then there is a kind of an appropriation of that new regime in order to re-establish the status quo, which is a counter-revolution. But both of them actually can be mapped on the temporal line. But there is no spatial, let's say, dynamic involved to it. The breaks also are temporal in nature, and the appropriations are also temporal in nature. The old world, new world, all of them actually still have the same spatial foundation, at least geographic foundation, if not spatial, the same geographic foundations. Whereas he's proposing that there is another counter-revolution which is taking place, which he calls the settler revolution. And in a very strange way, he proposes that settler revolution anticipates a kind of a crisis and a possible revolution within the European context. So instead of participating, blocking, or counteracting that revolution as it unfolds, it preempts the revolutionary upsurge and the change and so on, and exits that world and tries to find a solution on a spatial plane by moving elsewhere, by going to quote unquote empty lands, terra nulla, which in the Israel case also has a biblical justification. But it need not always be that, there could be different justification. But this whole idea of empty land is central. That a social problems can be addressed by avoiding revolution, by displacement, by going elsewhere, by starting the world afresh, by creating a new world. So a new world is not a break in time in a historical temporal sense, but a kind of a spatial displacement. Now, of course, it's a kind of an analytic category where Veracini is proposing that it's another kind of counter-revolution, that a spatial form of counter-revolution. But today, despite the very rich insights which the settler colonial framework provides us, it also actually kind of makes the present impasse quite palpable. That how do we then think about the time of politics today in the context of Gaza? Because everything is so spatialized. So all we can think in terms of the occupation, in terms of the land, in terms of partition, division, so on and so forth, displacement, demolitions, erasure, and so on and so forth. Whereas, when we're talking about Palestine as a world as Sir proposes, it is actually a certain duration, a certain intensity, a certain thought of politics, of resistance, of critique, which is also trying to hold the memory of the historical Palestine alive, which is also not letting the memory of Nakba be erased, the 1948 moment, and which is also keeping the possibility of a certain social, revolutionary social change within the third term, as Sir referred to in the morning, historical Palestine, thinkable, minimally thinkable, by creating speculative scenarios. So here I want to actually, kind of in the last section, turns towards a film called Lid, which was made in 2023, but I'll come to it via another film which was made in 2018 called Samouni Road, which was made in the context of Gaza. Just want to look at some excerpt from it to understand what are the different, let's say, strategies employed by both Samouni Road as well as Lid in terms of constituting that minimal distance of reflection. What are the subtractive and speculative strategy they employ? So could we, yeah, just.
كنت جئت يقرأ أبوي هذا كنت نعمل مغيرة مع الزراعة لما كنت أستعمل الزراعة أناظر نجد المية معملة مع الزراعة هذه فكانت جنب الأرض مليانة زراعة
وأنزلنا من المعصرات ماء ثجاجا لنخرج به حبا ونباتا وجنات ألفافا إن يوم الفصل كان ميقاتا. أين نفطر كلكم؟ يلا على الشغل يا ولاد.
So here the shift from the live action footage to animated visuality can actually be understood as a response to this problem of the saturation, where how do we actually subtract from the image as evidence by producing image as speculation, as memory, as thought, as imagination, and not merely recording of the fact or the reality. So in a way, breaking from the very indexicality of the photographic image, which is why it was very difficult to think about animation and documentary consistently in the history of cinema, because documentary was premised upon the indexical foundation of the photographic image. It is only with, let's say, Chris Marker to begin with, who creatively started interjecting animated visuals into documentary. But we see actually this emerging as a thread in last 15 years, particularly after Waltz with Bashir, Ari Folman's film about a traumatic event where there is a loss of memory, and the recovery of the memory takes place through testimony or audio interviews which are animated. Some of you may have seen Waltz with Bashir. From Waltz with Bashir, which was made around 2008-2009, which is precisely the point where we see the beginning of this media society or this image saturation. So it kind of anticipates and starts thinking towards a different creative or the aesthetic response to the present impasse, a speculative, subtractive response. And from there on, you see several films. Within the Palestinian context, this is not the first film. 1 year before that, there is a film called Naila and the Uprising, which is on the first Intifada and the role women played during that in 1980s, where there are interviews, testimonies, and instead of reenactment, you have animated sequences of the past. Then you have a film called Flee, which is again a contemporary political context, uses animated visuality. Then Lid, the excerpts from that we are going to see. Now, if one simply looks at the academic debates on the animated documentaries or animated visuality in last 10-15 years, we see a certain contextualization of it. And one interesting source they trace back is the quote-unquote unreliable status of the indexical images in the contemporary times, which is to say that how do you differentiate between the doctored and the actual images? There is a kind of a cognitive uncertainty, a doubt, a perpetual doubt that whether it is doctored or not. That is one of the source from which the animated visuality particularly starts infiltrating into the field of news. So there are certain, especially online news channels, who take recourse to animated visuality, so as not to kind of get into this conundrum. The second source is, of course, that yes, in last 10 years or so, there is an increasing access to certain events at the level of visual. But yes, so many other, let's say, events remain opaque to visuals for various reasons. It's not that there is always a lack of access, but there is a lack of visual evidence or the material or the footage. So then the animated visuality is used to reconstruct it at an imaginative level, because you constantly need some kind of a visual referent to run while you are making. So in a way, this visual culture prompts you to create some visual substitute for that lack of actual image. So that's another source. Then the third source is, of course, the gamification, that how the virtualization and the gamification of images is a source through which the animation starts infiltrating. And particularly in the live action films, the distinction, especially after the coming of digital intermediate in late 1990s, which is a form of intervention into the grading of the colors, now has reached to a threshold where you cannot really make a distinction between a shot image and a generated image, particularly with artificial intelligence. So that is also unsettling the distinction between the pure live action image or shot by camera as opposed to, let's say, with visual effects, special effects, computer graphics, and generative capacities and so on, the enhanced image, augmented image. But I'm actually just kind of laying it out for simple reason that I don't think these films can simply be understood by those broader lines of analysis which are made in the field of animated visuality. In fact, one of the other interesting lines of inquiry is coming from eco-criticism, that what is the cost of these animated visuality? It comes at a humongous cost. The carbon print of animated. Yeah, there are serious articles, particularly on Samouni Road. Yeah, that the workflows and the waste and the digital waste and so on and so forth. Now, of course, all of these can be kind of considered as separate lines of inquiry and dealt with separately, but for our present context and the present thematic, so to say, one needs to understand, and that's a proposition I would like to make, that these as the aesthetical political strategies to actually constitute a minimal distance and respond to this impasse and the saturation of the contemporary moment, where I see these films, Samouni Road and later Lid. So I'll just look at specific instances in Samouni Road where, now this is a very interesting context, that in the first one she is telling about how she used to go to this orchard prior to the war and where there was father and so on, and she puts the hairband on her eye, and that actually opens up to the animated. So there are different kinds of triggers, as we will see. So in a way, the emergence of animated visuality in each of these contexts has a very specific situatedness in the narrative itself. That there is an interplay of seeing going on there. So like in Waltz with Bashir also, that a lack of memory is prompting the animated visuality, the speculative nature of it. Yeah. So here, the television is the context.
اليوم السابع على التوالي ما زالت الهجمات الإسرائيلية تعصف بقطاعها. مخاطرة الأجانب تأتي كمؤشر لاضطراب الهجمة البرية الإسرائيلية في الساعة الصبح.
So one of the important episodes in the film, which is now the imminent attack, appears on the television on Al Jazeera channel as animated. But the way we arrive at it, we start with children watching television, the cartoons actually get animated. From there on, we keep changing the channels from different excerpts, popular film to football. So suddenly it actually unsettles the relationship between the document and the image. This is a very crucial actually problem in the history of documentary, is that how does one disauthenticate the document? Because document is primarily that requires to be authenticated, but no amount of authentication is sufficient. You have to continuously authenticate. Yeah? Because it's like an endless chain of authentication. There is no final authority which can authenticate any document, right? Which is why the status of a document always remains kind of like open-ended, one could say, that a new evidence can come and kind of challenge the veracity of the document, or the authority which has kind of authenticated a certain document can withdraw that authentication and tell that no, this document is no longer authentic. Yeah? As one could say, like with demonetization, for example, it's a kind of withdrawal of that authentication. But with this strategy, what it is doing is that it is kind of completely challenging this whole paradigm of authentication itself and disconnecting the logic of evidence and the logic of image. Whereas the foundation of documentary cinema is that image is evidence because of the indexicality. But by separating the two, it opens up a very different play of imagination, where a narrative could actually be constructed which reflects upon the very act of seeing itself. So the way the television becomes a site here, in the context later, where now with the imminent attack, the father, who is also a priest, he kind of summons all of them and is reading Quran, and he's trying to make sense of the attack through the images from Quran. And later Amal actually retreats and reads Quran by herself late at night. So let's just look at that reading sequence. in her dream, the actual elements of the attack, could be tanks or planes and so on, get morphed and intermixed with the biblical imagery read out to her by her father. So again, this interplay of the actual and the imaginary becomes a very site of thinking about the existence from the vantage point of a child, that what it does at a mental psychic level to a child in terms of making sense of that very attack, what exactly is going on. And from there, when the actual attack takes place, something very shattering happens in the film, that it actually turns towards the surveillance image as a template and animates that very template. Because usually that is considered to be the evidence par excellence of something taking place, which is why it is surveillance cameras are instituted everywhere. And we also consent to it in the very devices we use for shooting. So that's a kind of irony, that you using the camera to surveil on somebody, but you also allow yourself to be surveyed. So in a way, the surveillance becomes really the most important part of the shift in the history of image making, what we're calling as media society, image society, and so on and so forth. So, which is why when the attack takes place that night, we'll see the excerpt where, and it's a continuation of this sequence itself. We never go back to quote unquote indexical live action material. We remain on the animated plane, and within that later the attack takes place.
مش دول اللي طخوا أكتر من 5 دول اللي طخوا، بس أكتر واحد اللي طخوا يعني واحد كان شكله أسمر وكانت له لحية، كان يعني وإحنا في الأوضة كل شوية يقعد ينشن على صوته في الاستهتبة، لما طلعنا قاعد يضحك ويبزق على صوته، ما كانش شايف لأنه كان زي باقي الموت، ما كانش يعني مضوع ولا شيء.
وين؟ شوفت وليد؟ تعال خشوا هنا. تعال خشوا هنا. تعال وقف هذه بنتي. وين وليد؟ عارفة وين وليد؟
وين أمي؟ سيبيني بدي أمي. يلا
وين وليد؟ عارفة وين وليد؟
سيبيها. ايش صار؟ ايش اللي صار عندكم يا أمي؟
أبوي مات. استشهد. أبوي استشهد.
أختي الصغيرة شرت عندها عندي لحقت بنتي لا ما بتعمي حضرتها وقالت له بنتي يا خوالي خشت هي وياي جوا لما نمشي في الشارع لما وصلنا راس الشارع قالوا ربين اليهود على دار السوافير رجال سلطوا سلاحهم علينا وقال لي اقف وبعد ما خلانا نفتحوا عينا قالنا يلا روحوا عن السرير في دار ديكا بن عبد الغال غيرنا عليه وقعدنا فيه كان ينزل اخويا لما استشهد
Now, it may appear that this is entirely a choice of a filmmaker if we watch a film till this point. That this choice of taking a recourse to animated visuality of different orders, for memory, for the reading experience, for televised images, for surveillance images, and so on and so forth. But later in the films, shatteringly it is revealed that actually the source of it comes from the drawings Amal has been making. From there, this charcoal drawings which are animated are emerging. So primarily one is trying to construct the narrative of Amal's imagination. So we actually see her drawing book and she's telling us about those drawings, talking about those drawings, and it's a live action indexical material, a small fragment where she's speaking about her father who's dead. Yeah.
على أصحابه في إسرائيل وعن شغلهم وعلى بلدنا سكروا المعابر خلص يعني هو دور على شغل دور بس خلص هو قال هم سكروا المعابر وبطل يشتغل وصار يشتغل في الشركة وهي أنا وهي أختي هاي الدبابة كمان مهر أختي 3500 سرقوه يهود هاي أمي لما إجا عليها الصاروخ قلت لها أمي مالك يما ليش هيك أنت بشعرك مخلي الناس يتفرجوا عليك؟ قالت لي هيو منديلي مع أخوك عشان نتصافى مسكت المصلية وحطيتها على راسها يعني أنا لما اجيت هنا شفت المصلية وأكيد منظر مشمر
So this momentary pause on her face where she's looking inward, reflecting upon, is where actually these images are emerging from. That they are not just merely recording the reality which is out there, to document a violence or to produce a evidence and so on and so forth. It's something which cannot actually be documented. So that is really the threshold. In Five Broken Cameras, the threshold is retrospectively realized or actualized by constructing a narrative around the breaking apart of the cameras. But here, these are the kinds of images one can think actually whose relationship with photographic image cannot be just thought in a linear manner. The 19th century art criticism actually looked at it in a linear manner. And Andre Bazin, in fact, writes very interestingly about it in a very seminal essay called Ontology of Photographic Image. He says that the history of image making is actually tied to this mummy complex, that the preservation of life against the death. So from the mummies which could have been destroyed, you have these Fayum death portraits or death masks and so on and so forth. From there on, if one looks at the development of the visual art, the aim is to move towards exactitude, verisimilitude, yeah, to create images which are alike the very object. But of course, there's a minimal gap still remains, and that is overcome by photography. So with photography, finally, we can actually preserve life against death. And especially with the coming of cinematography, it's not just the space, but you also record the time itself. Now, if one takes that linear perspective, then one would always situate actually the drawing or any kind of an animated visuality as pre-cinematic or a pre-photographic or pre-indexical in that linear sense. But when it actually returns in the history of cinema, what exactly then its status? That makes actually the question of cinema far more interesting, is that cinema is not solely equatable with indexical images. So in a way, if one can take actually the art of moving image more seriously, so where the space and the time and the image and the sound becomes the fundamental coordinates, one should not entirely equate it with, let's say, only the history of photography or the cinematography. Because if that is our entry point, then today we are not, we won't be equipped to actually deal with the crisis which awaits us with that of generative images. And this whole puritanical insistence upon sticking on to celluloid, live action, yeah, and looking at any form of generative images as a kind of assault on human creativity and so on and so forth, yeah, machine generated and so on. All of this actually is founded upon this kind of a premise that photography is the foundation of cinema. Whereas the animated sequences which were made since the turn of the century, particularly the beginning of 20th century, were always seen as kind of inconsistent to the history of cinema. So it is very difficult to integrate them within any narrative of history of cinema, which passes from actuality to montage to coming of synchronized sound and all the other subsequent developments. And especially they were always kept apart from the history of the documentary. But now in last 10-15 years, when they are coming together, and especially within the context of Palestine, one could see a certain encounter taking place there. Which is not to say that all of animated visuality is to be equated with the subtractive or speculative strategies. These are certain deployments or mobilizations of those possibilities. But you can have several other kinds of deployments and mobilizations of them as well. In fact, a lot of these animated visuality is also used for scenario thinking. Yeah. So there is no inherent, let's say, possibility, capacity or essence which these strategies contain. So one will have to be very careful that we need not equate actually the strategies with the animated nature of those visualities. It's a means. Like the photographic was a means, or cinematographic images were a means. So in some sense, the fundamental point is that images are a means for cinema, not an end. Cinema is actually an operation on images. As we discussed, the organization of images, of subtraction, of speculative arrangement of images to construct narrative and so on and so forth, but in itself cannot be equated with any one kind or regime of images. So, which is why not only these memory, imagination are the zones which are opened up. Can I take 5-10 minutes? One can also actually go back to that founding moment of Nakba, the creation of Israel and the catastrophe for the Palestine, to also think other possibilities. So Lid is a film actually which opens with such alternative possibilities. So just would kind of see that. And it also very carefully constructs a narrative between imaginary and the real. It's made in 2023. And uses some of the ideas which are there in the science fiction literature of like parallelly existing worlds. So sometimes this film is also described as a science fiction documentary. It's mainly around this. So it's good. So it starts actually with this newsreel, archival newsreel. Yeah. And then moves to a different register while the story is being told by the city called Lid. So Lid is the narrator. The First World War.
خليني أحكي لكم عن 48 عن النكبة، الكارثة اللي صارت بكل بلاد، المذابح، التهجير، المحن، كل هذا صار بكل فلسطين. قصة الليل هي قصة فلسطين. سمعتوا مرة عن هاي النظرية اللي بتقول إنه لكل حدث في عدة نتائج ممكنين؟ هاي لحظات التغيير كلهم بيفتحوا عدة وقائع مدينة. هذا الحدث اللي صار بالضبط هون تحت كان هالقد صادم اللي مش بس صنع واقع بديل بعالم آخر بل نسق الواقع، فتح جرح بين الأبعاد، منفذ اللي لساته بيكبر، وهلأ المنفذ هذا صار مرئي. هذا الواقع يبديني مش بس الحاضر والمستقبل مختلفين عن الواقع اللي بتعرفوه، إنما كمان الماضي. هذا التاريخ خلق نسخة ثانية لإلي اللي فيها أنا ضليت المدينة اللي بتربط فلسطين مع العالم. تفهموا منيح اللحظة اللي فيها الواقع تنسق، النكبة 48. تعالوا نروح للواقع الثاني ونبلش هنا.
So the film actually kind of a strange intercutting between two parallel worlds. Yeah, the world where the state of Palestine came into existence, yeah, where the Jews who were coming from the Europe were welcomed, and the historical Palestine continued to evolve. Yeah, with Syria, with Lebanon, this greater Levant, and so on and so forth, a completely distinct possibility than the present reality. Yeah. And yet it uses the register of the newsreel and the juxtaposition of the actual historical newsreel, so to say, along with this imaginary animated newsreel, unsettles the very status of the newsreel as the account of history, by fracturing and opening up another possible historical world which could have emerged through this. So in a way challenging the very logic of the inevitability of the present. That this was not the only present thinkable or the possible, there were other presents thinkable and the possible. Whereas what we see in last 20-30 years is primarily the narrowing and shrinking of the possible presents which could have emerged. And the new historiography is exactly trying to open up what could have been those possible presents at different junctures in 48, in 67, and so on and so forth, even after 2005 or post-Oslo and so on and so forth. And especially when we are like now in the present, the images are so overburdened by what is happening on day-to-day basis, the possibility of a reflective distance upon what could have been the other worlds possible in 20th century remains entirely unthinkable because of the sheer saturation of trying to document what is going on day-to-day basis as things are unfolding. So in a way, not only that the present becomes the inevitable present, the images become kind of servile to that very inevitable present, where there is no possibility of thinking about other presents within this present. So what this film is trying to do is continuously going back and forth between the live action visuality, where what is happening is that in the history of this city lid, in the alternate reality, now there is no trace of Palestine. There is no trace of Nakba also. So if Nakba was an erasure, then there is an erasure of that erasure going on. And it's a complete normalization of the state of Israel's narrative of the present, where the filmmakers on the one hand are trying to keep the memory of the Nakba alive, but Nakba as a wound, Nakba not merely as a historical event, but as a rupture, as the film says at the beginning itself, that is a rupture in the reality. It's almost a dislocation. It's a destruction of a world, but that doesn't mean that that destruction was inevitable. It was possible that there could have been a reconstitution or a reconfiguration of that world. So that needs to be kept alive through the memory of the catastrophe, but the memory of the catastrophe is not merely the memory of suffering. It's a memory of a possibility of a historical Palestine and its reconstitution in the present, in the future. So I'll end with a sequence which is from the present, where a school teacher is discussing with children about their present. So there it becomes clear what is the strategy of the film and why this imaginary line is continuously juxtaposed with that of the present. Yeah.
وقت نحن نحكي عن الهوية، لما حدا يسألك ايش الهوية بس نفكر في على راسنا.
سجن.
سجن؟ ايش اهم شيء عندكم يكون معروف عليكم؟ مين ايش هويتكم؟ اللي كثير كثير بهمكم بيكون بالنص، والاشياء اللي هي موجودة بالهوية بس مش كثير مهمة بتكون حواليك. تعرف مين بده يبدأ؟ مين الجريء بده يبدأ؟ طب يلا ناديهم.
أنا ماشي كان عندي المسلمة.
ليش؟ ليش أهم شيء عندك ما تعرف هلا كمان 4 حواليها.
جريئة، رايقة، متميزة، متفوقة تعليمية.
خلصنا. تفضل يلا.
عربي،
مصري.
نوي النقاء.
تمام.
ملك. إيش؟ جريء.
جريء.
بحب عيلتي. فلسطينية. هوايتي عزف البيانو. طالبة في برنامج الصناعة. بحب أهم شيء يا ولد مسلم، متفوق تعليميا، مؤدب، طالب في برنامج الصناعة. إنسان ولد بحب إخوتي. الداوي عربي.
سؤال. لما نطلع هلا أولاد الله ما حدا يعرفني، في شغلات انتوا حطيتوها اللي هيك تعرفوا حالكم. يمكن 3 ذكرهم فلسطينية. ايش يعني فلسطين؟ وليش في الناس كانوا عاملينها تذكر هذا الكتاب؟
يعني زمان كان فلسطيني، أما هلا صار الدم
غير دمها. انت هلا تغير دمك هلا دمك ايه انت؟ مين يقول انه احنا
انت او مسلمين. انا مش اسرائيل ولا مش اسرائيل.
وين موجودة فلسطين؟ بس الغزة بالسعودية.
انا اقول عشان لبنان العراق.
لا فلسطين موجودة بالعراق ولكن سوريا فلسطين.
سوريا. طيب برضه
سمعت؟
ايش حاجة سؤال؟ سؤال.
بس أنت شو الفلسطينية موزعين؟ فلسطين وين موقعها؟ على الجغرافيا على الأرض وين موجودة فلسطين؟
جنوب. وين؟ دمشق. الصحراء. مصر.
Yeah. So this is actually the real of the present of lid is entirely absorbed by the state of Israel, and it is out there to erase every possible trace of Palestine, the world of Palestine, where the teacher is trying to keep minimally the world of Palestine alive amidst the state of Israel, where this question becomes very difficult for the children to understand where is Palestine. Because it's not a space she's talking about. It's not something which can be geographically stabilized as Gaza or West Bank or Jordan or Syria or Egypt. People give all kinds of answers. But in some sense, that also speaks the truth of Palestine as a world. That it may be spatially, geographically scattered, splintered, fragmented, and so on and so forth, but the fiction of a Palestine is kept alive, which is essentially the thought, the critique, the resistance is referring to Palestine as a world, which is Palestine as a fiction. So at that level, there is absolute homology between cinema, especially the documentary cinema, and its relation to fiction. The Jacques Rancière says that one should not counterpose documentary to fiction, but actually understand documentary as a mode of fiction, where there is an intermixing of memory, fabrication, imagination, actual, real, and so on and so forth. So in cinema, there are two modes of fiction: the imaginary fiction, where real is an effect, say verisimilitude, whereas documentary is a mode of fiction where real is a fact to be understood, interpreted, narrativized, and so on and so forth. But that also requires imagination. That also requires fabrication, also requires construction. So in a way, fundamentally, if world is a kind of an impurity and a hybridity and a construction and an imagination, then in a way cinema also organizes the images as a kind of a world in a homologous sense. So in that sense, cinema as an operation on images has a homologous relationship with Palestine as a world, as a political idea. So with that, I pause for today. We can take up a lot of these things in tomorrow's discussion. Yeah, I know it's today, like we kind of almost 6:23. We're planning to finish at the latest by 5:45 or 6. So if there are any immediate questions, comments, we can take it, or else if you want to kind of reflect upon it and take it to discussion tomorrow in the last session, you can do that as well, Apurva. It's your call. Because I don't know when you have to.
There are any questions we can take.
Okay, we can take. Sure. Okay.
So I just had a question of how and why animation becomes important.
So as one of the ways to kind of depart from or move away from the indexical nature of photographic images. Because photographic images have an evidentiary relationship with the reality, whereas animation can take a flight away from that evidentiary indexical nature. So that. But there is no doubt about it being constructed. There is no question of authentication of it.
I'm sure we'll discuss this tomorrow in greater detail, and it's late now, but this is extraordinary work you did for us. One of the things, and so many things, also films I was not able to see much, so I couldn't read the guide, but tracking is helping me. You're right. With Know the Land, there is a consciousness of not the limits of cinema, but the limits of the conditions of cinema. In that sense, formally a more modest film. While the one you showed, Five Broken Cameras, is clearly a film which actually, in terms of the very cinematic idea, has greater speculative, conspirative adventure.
Yeah.
While Novaland is more conscious of the limits placed on the very conditions of making such a film, but precisely because it's so aware of those conditions, it makes such a good film, such a great film. Without apparently entering into that speculative adventure.
Yeah.
That is a remarkable way of looking at these two films within the history of Palestinian cinema.
Yes.
And it's not a long duration, around just 15 years.
Yes.
And in that, the question of animation, or animation as a formal technique or resource.
Yeah.
That is an extraordinary historical analysis also, that because it's more recent, it's not going back to the history of Palestine itself.
Right.
But just 15 years. But within those 15 years, because of possibly technological shifts, not just technological shifts, but also maybe the intensification of certain thresholds of crisis in political history of the world, which have caused, in a brief period of time, very strong paradigmatic shifts. From broken images to broken cameras
to No Other Land.
And yet, there is still a central, and that beautiful last sequence you showed with the children in the classroom. Again, I was able to understand it because Rakesh was helping me with a certain, from the vantage point of Palestinian experience, a certain constitutive fiction, which is actually a place which no one knows where it is in terms of, because geography is also legitimacy. To locate it in space would also require the legitimate coordinates located in terms of
cartography.
Yeah, the cutoff, state status, name of the, we say Palestine, but unless Palestine is a name on which there is an institutional agreement, it is not on a map. In the way, let's say, other states are. So at what level to make Palestine intelligible to Palestinians themselves would require fiction, because the real of Palestine has not gone away.
No.
Absolutely not. Because it's because they are Palestinians, they're subject to that every moment crisis and, specter of bomb dropping or the baton of a police, of a military guy hitting either your body or the camera. So the real is there, but the real has no name as yet. So that's Palestine is a fiction.
Yeah.
So that it is there, but around it there is so much change in the last 15-20 years, as if. That came out so fantastically in your presentation. At least I was really mesmerized by that. And the longer analysis, of course, on documentary, the meaning of documentary, well, we will go into those things in the panel tomorrow, hopefully.
Yeah.
Another day. But this sort of condensed period with so much movement, and the question of Palestine still remaining absolutely, unaddressed and yet real.
Yeah.
That was particularly interesting for me. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way you kind of paraphrase and summarize it, I think almost Palestine is, in that sense, as you said, that there is no immediately recognizable historical name for it, and yet it remains the name of the future of fiction. Of another world, of thinking about world itself. Yeah.
Now it's come back in a strange, tortured way, with very little real hopes about it. But it's come back because of what has happened in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
As a question of self-determination and a two-state possibility. Who knows how much reality it has for actual living Palestinian people.
Right.
I do not know.
Absolutely.
But for our statist discourse, everyone's talking about two-state.
And
so there's a strange distance there too.
Absolutely. And tomorrow, in fact, I thought that after the opening up of this discussion, when we would look at From Ground Zero, which is an anthology film where 22 artists come together to make it, where one actually sees the tension sustained between these two modes, the indexical mode and a mode which is trying to subtract away from it, a kind of a speculative mode in that compilation itself. So,
well, I suppose a certain, I don't know what to call it, indexical or mimetic or kind of just
like a reportage mode or a certain kind of a recording mode.
That optimism as a residual optimism does remain, because it also travels as information, as data more quickly now.
Right.
So, for instance, in the earlier period during the war, when people were showing solidarity, till things got so bad that no one more or less remained where he or she was in Gaza. Everyone, 80% of the population was getting displaced. No one was really anymore to be seen in terms of a permanent address in Gaza. But a little before that, when there was all this happening, but still there was some stability, and information was coming in And in Gaza, people were responding to that. So there was in one report I saw, and I saw that image too. Someone got it on a mobile phone, on a house, outside the house. There was a protest in New York, I think, asking for Palestinian independence. Students, I think encampment time, yes, encampment time. And there was outside the wall of a house written, "Thank you, Columbia." Something like that. You know, thank you, whatever, Harvard. Columbia, one of those. Outside the wall of a house. Today you won't find it because there is no such house anymore. But in the earlier period, you at least saw that, which is more or less a kind of still a fundamental recording optimism.
Yeah.
But at least that optimism is there.
Right.
You know, so that function remains.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that's happening.
Right. So I, in fact, liked your formulation. There is a certain modesty and a self-consciousness of that. Yeah.
In no other land. Yeah. Absolutely. You can see that. You can feel that.
Yeah. And yet the films which are made actually little after that, like from Ground Zero, all the films are made in 2024.
Yeah.
Where what happens to that would also be interesting to kind of see and reflecting upon that.
Ground Zero.
Yeah.
Because I read a summary of it. There are lots of things going on.
Yeah.
Also because the earlier film we have been talking about, Far From Vietnam, is also an anthology film.
Exactly.
Also a comparative film.
Yes.
So that would be interesting.
Yeah.
Also the animation that the earlier films had, there was a kind of the texture was kind of a juxtapose cartoon. It's a kind of different kind of animation.
In Samouni Road, no?
Where it is inspired from there or not?
Juxtapose would be very important.
Possibly, one could actually, and there are available material on the film. Through that, maybe one could investigate this. Yeah. But even Frank Miller, I was thinking, Sin City.
Of course, if in terms of animation and feature films, then one probably will have to talk about Quentin Tarantino.
Exactly. So Frank Miller and Tarantino collaborated on Sin City. No? So
That entire school of thought.
Yeah.
But then one must also go back to an earlier history, which probably, and that would be of interest from the angle of thinking about modern wars. After Hiroshima. Yeah, the Japanese comic book.
Yes. Or in fact, the development of the Japanese animation as a response to war itself. Yeah.
That would be another genealogy, which would be of...
And Miyazaki, or Ghibli and that entire tradition, which is also moving away because there are actually, I was introduced to the work of his colleague very recently, who is closer to, let's say, Ozu kind of a work. Whereas Miyazaki actually was moving more towards, let's say, certain kind of a fable, magical idiom within animation. Takahawa, I think that's the name of it.
How to think about it within a political problem. How to meet with the impossible reality of Hiroshima. In an unending history of the consequences of Hiroshima, which carry on up to now.
Yeah.
People dying still of the Hiroshima.
Absolutely.
The atomic pollution.
And the other very important film for this is, we were in the morning talking about Cambodia, Thailand and other. It's a film which is looking at the Khmer Rouge, where there are no documentation or photographs available. So they use these little figurines to construct that entire episode. It's called The Missing Picture. This is Reed Penny's film. So it was shown in CUG when we were screening basically the 100 years of October Revolution. So we're kind of looking at the various consequences. So that is one film. And the other film, which is taking the more classical route of reflecting upon indexical images, the essay one, is called In the Intense Now, which we showed, So the found footage around the time of 1968.
And then there would be a third form, which you are the one who again taught me about that, and then I've been thinking about it and seeing it and talking about it. Tomorrow maybe we can have a discussion on that. is the didactic parable.
Exactly. Parable.
Which is inextinguishable fire.
Inextinguishable fire. Absolutely.
Yeah. Which is really neither found footage nor fiction in the ordinary sense, but it is something which is didactic device.
Right, and that device actually has a very interesting later history in Peter Watkins' work, who recently passed away. So there are two ways in which he, like in a hyperbolic mockumentary, that as if the Third World War has started, he's made documentaries about that, or later he made a film on Paris Commune, which is televised live account of Paris Commune, which is a theatrical reenactment as a didactic parable. It's a very big film. So some of those, like the theatrical mode or the enactment mode or model,
small form.
Small form.
That is the other documentary.
So in a way, one could look at all of these as strategies primarily which are trying to.
Small form, I don't know. Maybe I don't know that much. But how far is that small form still a feasible resource for filmmakers?
Right.
Now?
Right.
It's something I'd like to know.
More about.
I don't know much about it.
Maybe
Yeah.
do you wanted to know about settler colonialism point that you had made?
Okay.
Stop here for today. Maybe you can.
No, I mean we'll talk about it tomorrow as well. But what I meant was to draw kind of a parallel between a homologous saturation of a certain representational strategy, which is to document violence as it unfolds, and the analytic framework of settler colonialism. That both actually reach a certain kind of an impasse today. That where do you go from it? Because there is a kind of an endlessness which is built into the analytic framework of settler colonialism itself. The way it distinguishes from classical colonialism is primarily around the point of having an end or an expiry date. So then the future is not thinkable, or any possibility of a change is not thinkable.
Unless some such catastrophe, kind of autoimmune catastrophe takes place within the settler colony logic, which implodes. So in a way, the question is...
No, so then either or actually. So either the settler are completely destroyed or the natives are completely destroyed.
It can go,
either.
In a way, both are destroyed. In their present shape. The settler colony requires also the to be both wiped out and present in a strangely, and in America of course it has happened in such a way that it's nearly now completely wiped out, but that's not the case with Israel.
Absolutely.
Now of course the son is more famous, but I have actually heard
Mamdani's book, neither settler nor native.
So we heard him speak about this question in Delhi, and he's ended up saying, and he's not the only one, but simply saying that let us just simply speak about the end of Israel.
Yes.
This is at one level very provocative. But actually he's not saying this as a self-indulgent wish fulfillment, but as something very specific.
Absolutely.
That project itself, with what is happening, and this we heard in vacation 1.5 years back, right? So
when the book came out, actually.
In the first year of the war, because things had already gone so obviously catastrophic. But in a way, that kind of catastrophic action of a state spells the end of that state. So in a very different way, we had Giorgio Agamben write a short piece called End of Judaism, which surely is even more catastrophic than End of Israel. No? To say End of Judaism, one of the great Jewish philosophers of our times. So such things are being said by different people, philosophers and scholars and historians.
Right. No, as he is also, I was actually looking at his book, and particularly the case for him which is instructive or didactic in this regard is South Africa. There are several chapters. So there is a chapter on India also, on South Africa, on Israel, and so on and so forth. So in South Africa, he says there is a kind of a reconstitution which took place, which is neither actually going on the nativist side and the nationalist side, nor this white supremacist. So through that, at least at the level of political imagination, a certain new possibility opened up, which is the end of the apartheid regime. So in some sense, the end of Israel is a kind of the end of a political regime.
Yeah, of course.
Exactly. Yeah.
Doesn't mean end of anybody in terms of real people.
Absolutely. So reconstitution, possibility of, yeah, yeah. So now, of course, those who've been studying, one of our colleagues actually studied Vineet Thakur, the consequences of the post-apartheid regime in the last 25-30 years and so, and a critical analysis of that tells that what are the new questions and the crises which emerge through that kind of a reconstitution. So to compare notes on that might be very useful to understand, because I think Mamdani's book in that sense is a provocation to the settler colonialism debate, saying that one needs to still think about a historical possibility.
So and both settler colony and, I mean, that question, but also long duration.
Long duration. Absolutely. Okay. So in a way, kind of looking at the, as he starts off actually, with the Moors and the Spain, that's where he begins. Yeah. So he's saying this and what's happened to the Jews and so on and so forth. So his point is that, and which has been kind of established in the field of international relations, is that that nation state, sovereign nation state, has colonial imperial foundations.
Yeah, but then in his talk, I found him talk mostly about the impasse or the end of the idea of the Israeli nation as that.
Yeah.
But I didn't really find, and he was aware of it, because I didn't ask anything. Someone else asked something and he said, well, I've not really addressed that. He didn't talk about the constitution or the structure of the modern state.
In the book he actually talks about it.
He talked about the question of the nation.
No, of course, and that too, the emphasis is more on the problem of minority. So majoritarian nature of the nations, modern.
In India we are definitely debating all the time now. More and more so. But what about the sort of horizon of the state, which seems to be, in terms of thinking of the state, something which seems to be entirely I mean, there is no alternative to that horizon, it seems.
No, that there is no, absolutely. So which is why the case of South Africa slightly becomes ironical there, because then it seems that only a certain kind of a state becomes a resolution to the problem of nation.
You're absolutely. There is one way of understanding the South African, and that's the point I was making in the morning, the South African sense of true solidarity, unlike some hypocritical positions states take, including the Indian state, I have no hesitation in saying. South African state seems to be a little more authentic because of not because of state, but because of a kind of real political memory of their struggles. One of the slogans which is so uplifting in the worst kind of times when this bombing was happening was on behalf of Palestinians that we are all a black people. It was such an uplifting.
You mentioned that in the book.
Such things took place. And South Africa brought it to the court, international court, as a state. But the real reason for that to happen was a living memory of their struggles, solidarity. That is where, when it comes to state-driven actual solidarity, very rare. You won't probably find it with anyone. You find it at the level of hybrid social struggles, social solidarity, and in Europe more than anywhere else in the West, in America, but not as states. South Africa is an exception at this point. But even that is subject to a lot of real politics, no? When did South Africa do this? When ANC was in majority. Now ANC is not in majority. It is a government depending on an alliance with some of the moderate Afrikaner parties. Now it can't take the same position anymore. Thankfully, when it was in majority, it brought the case. So the case lives on. But South African government is not able to speak so strongly. People do, not government. Because real politics has come in the middle of things and they are dependent for the government on the white Afrikaner party. So you saw what happened when Ramadas went to to White House, to Trump. And Trump openly said things which were absolutely. So when Gaza genocide is happening, he's talking about white genocide in South Africa. Genocide of whites in South Africa. And he still does that. He still, the moment the name South Africa comes, he becomes abusive. That South Africa is a very bad country. Not country, but state, because it is committing genocide of the whites there. And the South African government today can't speak with a clear, strong voice because it depends on white party.
Yeah.
So this real politics keeps coming. But still people's solidarity is there.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a...
Yeah. But in any other questions or comments or observations? Which, if not, we'll take it to tomorrow. Yeah. Okay.
So we bring today's session.
Yeah. Thank you for your attention and
thank you.
Yeah.